possible here.
Perfect.
All right.
Let's do.
Yeah.
Okay. You're gonna move a little bit to my left. Great.
How you doing? Oh yeah. I need to change that. Yeah. I'll see you follow.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll make sure that you get
Yeah,
a
you
copy.
bet. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. If we could take our seats and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm William Boyd. I'm on the faculty here at University of Colorado Law School, and I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our Future Grid Conference. I want to especially thank Commissioner Tony Clark from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for joining us and delivering our keynote, and our Dean, Phil Weiser, will introduce him in a moment. I want to thank all of our panelists. We have a true all-star cast here with us today. Several state officials, Chairman Joshua Appel from the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, Commissioner Ann McCabe from the Illinois Commerce Commission, Jeff Ackerman from the Colorado Energy Office. We have a couple of other rock stars who traveled from far away to join us. Sue Tierney, who has just an incredible background and experience at state and federal government and the private sector. She's with us today. Professor Joel Eisen, one of the leading energy law scholars in the country. And then we have, last but not least, some of our amazing local talent. Adrian Tuck from Tendril, Amanda Bybee from Namaste, John Phelan from Fort Collins, Justin Segal from Simple Energy, Diana Moss from the American Antitrust Institute, but she has the good sense to live here in Colorado, Tim Inwall from Nest Labs, John Wallington from UPC Capital, and Mark Detsky from Dietz & Davis. And I want to thank Mark and Dietz & Davis for not only joining us and being here, but also sponsoring the reception. Phil and Sharon Jacobs, a newly hired professor of energy and environmental law here at the law school, deserve much of the credit for putting this together, and it's great to have Sharon back from maternity leave. I want to thank the whole team at Silicon Flatirons, Anna, Jamie, Cactus, and the rest for putting on this event. I'm not going to say much about the content of the conference. We have 3 great panels lined up on grid modernization, distributed energy resources, and data issues raised by the grid, and we'll do some framing remarks for each one of those panels. But I will say a couple of things very briefly. There's so much happening across all aspects of the power sector today. Many interesting experiments underway in different states across the country. Lots of interesting federalism questions emerging out of the changing nature of the grid, new business models, new regulatory models, and of course lots of challenges and opportunities in all of this, especially in the midst of new regulatory requirements and rapid technological change. We're going to explore a number of these issues today, but we're going to focus primarily on the downstream sort of distribution edge of the grid where much of the action is happening. But we'll do so in the context of the whole system, the whole big complex machine that is our electric power grid. So as I said, each of the panels will provide some framing remarks, an introduction to this, and then we'll dig in and want to make sure this is very interactive and hear from all of you. I know we all want to hear from Commissioner Clark, but before I hand it over to Phil to introduce Commissioner Clark, I do want to say a couple of things about Phil. This is probably the last time I'll share the podium with Phil while he is dean, and I think it's no surprise to any of you here who know him that we will miss him greatly as dean. He has done a truly outstanding job steering Colorado law through challenging times. We've emerged, I think without question, as one of the strongest and best positioned law schools in the country under his leadership. But it's really his commitment, support, and tireless enthusiasm for everything we're doing in the natural resources, energy, and environmental program, and specifically in our efforts to build a really top or first-class energy law program that he deserves special thanks. He has really just been an incredible partner. He's hard to keep up with. It can be exhausting at times, for sure, but he has been all in on his support for an engagement with what we're doing with our students, with our faculty, with our alumni, and our many partners inside and outside the university. I know that Sharon Jacobs and the rest of our energy and environmental law faculty and everyone else in the Colorado law community inside and outside the building join me in thanking you, Phil, for your service as dean. So please join me in thanking Phil for his incredible service. So I'm going to turn it over now to Phil and to introduce Commissioner Clark.
So first, a few comments, and one is to thank William, who really is the dean of our energy law program. I don't think there's a better one in the country. So for those of you who have gotten to know us a little bit or not that well, let me just refresh your recollection. So as I said, William in effect is the dean and leader. He's a tremendous scholar and leader in this area. You'll hear a little for him moderating, but he's modest, so you'll have to look at his webpage to get a sense of his accomplishments. Sharon Jacobs is the top, I would call it, emerging or younger energy law scholar. We are extraordinarily lucky to have her aboard. She's a fabulous addition, and along with William and I helped plan this conference. Bruce Kramer can't be here today, but is literally the leader in oil and gas and teaches in our oil and gas area and is a fabulous part of the team. Ray Gifford and Paula Connolly, I don't know if Paul is here, teach a seminar on utilities regulation and make quite a dynamic duo. Ray, the former chair of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, Paula, formerly of Excel. Mark Safdie, who I think might be here later today, teaches in energy law finance issues, extremely gifted practitioner and teacher. And then I want to give a shout out to Britt Banks, because he is in his, where's Britt? He's in his swan song like me. Britt has led the Getchus Wilkinson Center as it's really transitioned from natural resources in the traditional sense to natural resources, energy, and environment. And as the issues today are going to touch on pretty squarely, natural resources issues relate closely with energy issues and with environmental issues. So having energy at the center of the center is not an accident, and Britt's leadership and interest in these topics has been a huge boon, and his leadership will continue even as he hands the baton to a new executive director of the Getchus Wilkinson Center. That search is going to get started shortly. If people have ideas about candidates, Britt leaves big shoes to fill, and we appreciate his service. I want to make a couple other comments before I turn the podium over to Tony. First, you'll notice as we have our panels moderated that the first questions will go to students, and that reflects a level of commitment to our students in this area. And in part because William is such a gifted teacher that we have so many students interested in energy law. I've had a number of students who took his class and said it transformed my view of what I want to do. This is an exciting area. There's so much happening. There's a lot happening here in Colorado. We happen to have one of those extraordinary students who's still on the market, Kevin Blake. Let me say a thing about Kevin. He made my day, maybe my week, when he sent me an email and said, I'm interested in meeting with this person, I see you're connected on LinkedIn, and I'd love to bring a friend of mine along to the meeting, because it showed what kind of person he was. It wasn't like only looking out for himself. He was looking out for his friend as well, and he's willing to take the initiative. Whoever hires him is getting an extraordinary talent, and it is a shocker he's still on the market. So whoever's thinking about a talented person with extraordinary knowledge, initiative, and capabilities, Kevin, raise your hand. Okay, that's Kevin. So by the end of the reception, he may not be around anymore. Talk to him on a break. He's someone who we're really proud of. And if you need a reference for him, you can talk to Ray, who taught a seminar, and others, or to Sharon or William. Really, we're proud of him, and he's going to make a huge asset to someone's team. So one more thing in terms of this overall initiative on energy and energy innovation. We have a lecture lined up for next fall, September 22nd. You want to save the date. Paul Joskow is probably the preeminent energy economist, would you say, Ray? Yeah, and he's coming here to give the Schultz Lecture next year. The Schultz Lecture is a great tradition, and to underscore that, I would say Tony Clark is a prior Schultz lecturer. The goal of the Schultz Lecture, which is a real pillar for the Getchell-Wilkinson Center and the energy innovation effort, is to bring a distinguished leader to help us as a community raise our thinking. This fall we had Governor John Hickenlooper, who did a great job, and that's on the web for people to watch. I know next fall Paul Joskow will do a great job. Tony did a fabulous job a few weeks ago. I do have the pleasure now, as William promised, introducing Tony Clark, who I've been friends with for a while. What we in this country may not take enough time to reflect on is the importance of public servants who have both incredible intelligence and integrity. And Tony Clark is someone really special in that pantheon, and the energy world is better for his leadership. At the FERC, he has brought the level of intellectual rigor that has raised the quality of the work product, and he has engaged the employees there in a respectful, elevating way. The people who work directly for him, his legal advisors, you would not believe what they say about him and his humanity, his intelligence, his commitment to getting sound public policy. So it's not an accident. This is his third time speaking in 4 years. We had a conference on the changing energy mix, which is about to get even more interesting as a topic. That was, at the time, the beginning of the natural gas revolution, and what's that been doing. We're now about to have a carbon rule that's going to put some real pressure on that energy mix again. We had him talk about enforcement issues when he came here for the Schultz Lecture, and today we're giving him the floor with the future of the grid, which is at the center of a lot of these pressures, and I know he will do a phenomenal job in teeing this off. He is a relatively close-by neighbor, having grown up in North Dakota, and he is on loan to DC. And without further ado, Tony Clark.
Thanks, Dean Weiser, for that very, very kind introduction. I have to tell you, to me, I get the biggest kick in the world out of speaking at either law schools or at conferences where they give CLEs for people to come listen to me, because you have to understand, I'm someone who, when I was 22 years old, specifically avoided law school because I hated citing things, I didn't like footnotes, and I didn't think that going to law school would probably be all that much fun. So now, when I speak at some place like this, or heaven forbid someone gets CLEs for listening to me talk about something, it's a big thrill. In fact, some of those very legal advisors you were talking about a few weeks ago, they said, Commissioner, we've got this conference we want to go to. We need some CLEs. I said, what do you need to go to a conference for? You get to listen to me all day. I'll give you 3 CLEs just for that. But apparently that doesn't work out. So they went to the conference. Thanks for the invitation to be with you here. And let me also second the admonition that Dean Weiser gave about if you're a student and you're thinking about a field in which you can make an impact, and one that is transformational right now, is one that is just a fun field to be in, I'd recommend energy law. It's a great area to be in. In fact, I was at it was an EBA, Energy Bar Association conference not too long ago, and a retiring attorney was extolling the virtues of energy law, and he said, we're finally back. Energy lawyers are hot. And I don't know that I go that far, but I would I am thinking about starting a campaign, energy lawyers are hot, tax lawyers are not. Hopefully there aren't any tax lawyers in the room. It is a great field in which to be in, so I'd encourage your interest in it. What I thought I would do today is I'll frame the future of the grid and where I think we may be heading in terms of what I'll outline is 4 tensions that I think will exist over the foreseeable future, and that will in some way or another probably drive what the grid looks like as we move forward. The first tension that I'll talk to you a little bit about is tension that's probably closest to the heart of what the rest of this conference is going to be discussing, which is this issue of information technology and information at the edge of the grid that's coming in and shaping the grid in a way that we probably wouldn't have anticipated 15 or 20 years ago. And I'll frame this tension as this. It's the tension of how utilities have traditionally delivered service versus power and information at the edge of the network. Now, if this sounds a little bit familiar, it probably should, because it's a transformation that we've been going through in another sector that a lot of utility commissions deal with, which is the telecommunications sector. I'll talk just a little bit about that in a bit, some of those parallels. But think about how, really since the beginning of the development of electric utilities, how has power been delivered? It's very much been from the center of the network, large central generating station power being delivered in one way, really not a lot of information or feedback or power at the edge of the network other than you get a bill at the end of the month and you choose to turn on the light switch, you choose to set your thermostat at a certain level, but all very much information coming in one direction. Today that's changing and breaking down in ways that, as I said, we probably haven't anticipated up to this point. It's because of the convergence of technology and telecommunications and things that are allowing to be done at the edge of the grid that actually empower consumers, whether it be through distributed generation, on-site generation, solar rooftop, whether it be through demand response at the customer level that somehow engages with some form of price responsive demand, whether it be meters at the premises, whether it be appliances that have smart capabilities built into them and are able to interact with the grid itself. All of these things are empowerment and information at the edge of the network. Now, I said there's a parallel that we can draw, which is there was very much a transformation that was not entirely dissimilar that has been made on the telecommunication side of things. And thinking back, it's almost hard to imagine. But if you think of utilities as a powerful monopoly, they have nothing on what old Ma Bell was, right? I mean, Ma Bell was the mother of utilities. It was ubiquitous in a way that nationwide, in a way that electric utilities really never have been. They've been much more siloed on a state-by-state or a regional basis. If you think about the ownership of the network itself dating back into the 1960s, remember, the Bell network owned the end-use premise equipment itself, too. So the phone at the end of the line was part of that monopoly network. The equivalent would be the electric utility owning your appliances in your house that connected to the network, right? But we went through a transition in the telecommunications industry. The fact that we went through that transition and have emerged out on the other end tells me that I think regulators and consumers can handle the transition that we're going to be going through, I think, over the next several years on the energy side. And regulators are going to play a very key role. There are going to be a lot of decisions that are going to be made, energy regulators and policymakers at all levels of government, that will decide exactly how this rolls out. Some of these, I think we can draw on lessons that we learned from the telecommunication wars of the past. One of the things we learned is when you had a closed network, a truly closed monopoly, when you set rates in a system like that that's closed, you can have all sorts of implicit and explicit subsidies, and it doesn't really matter that much because there's no competition that comes in and can exploit or arbitrage those subsidies. It means you might have some cross subsidies here or there, but you sort of live with them as part of the political economy. Once that network begins getting opened up, the tolerance for implicit and explicit subsidies gets much more difficult because then those become actual cross subsidies that consumer classes have pitting themselves against each other, and businesses can come in and arbitrage the particular subsidy mechanisms that you have. So it creates an impetus for commissioners to try to get those economic signals right as they go through rate design. We're already seeing a lot of this on the distribution side of the grid, as regulators who are in states that are seeing a lot of distributed generation coming online are having to grapple with these issues of how do you design proper rates in a system that doesn't look like the system that we used to have. Regulators are going to be dealing with rules for interconnection and how these distribution side and information at the edge of the grid resources are going to be interconnecting, ensuring that you have access on some form of a level playing field so that they can interact with the markets and the grid that we have. Think about things like energy storage devices. I'm a huge fan of energy storage devices. I think it's one of the real promising technologies that we have out there. It makes so many things on the grid better if you can have meaningful energy storage. It's things because it deals with intermittency issues, with renewables. It can deal with certain ancillary services, balancing of the grid itself. It overcomes, at least in part, some of the huge challenges we've always had with electricity, which is basically unique amongst commodities that I can think of, which is that it can't be stored, right? That electricity has to be produced basically at the time that it's consumed. Which is a big difference in the workings of the grid as with just about anything else that we have. If you have energy storage devices, things like, things as simple as a hot water heater, right? I mean, pretty basic device, but if you think about it, it's really, in essence, can be used as a battery, because what's it doing? It's storing energy in a thermal form in that hot water. Now, so what can you do with that as you have a smarter grid? Well, you can do things like, it's one of my favorite companies because it happens to be a North Dakota-based company, a company called Steffes Corporation. It's out of Dickinson, North Dakota, not all that far from this area. And they produce a device that sits on your water heater, and through pretty basic telecommunications equipment, an always-on broadband line, can interact with the market and tell your water heater to run when it's most advantageous to pull power off of the grid, and when we need to have power pulled off of the grid. For example, when there's a lot of wind power that's coming online in the middle of the night and we need to suck up that power that would otherwise be unused, but then not using the power when we don't want you to use it, such as at peak periods of the day. Now, for you, if your water heater, if you get hot water out of your tap, that's all that you care. When it's sort of cycling on and off is less of a concern to you, but that's the kind of information technology that's coming on at the edge of the network that's going to make the grid work that much better. Fast ramping resources. As we have more intermittent resources, we need more fast ramping resources to be able to balance that generation out. The ability for fast ramping resources to interconnect and have their value compensated in, for example, FERC jurisdictional markets is something that we're working on every day. A final issue in this tension that I'll bring up is the ongoing challenge. I don't think it's an insurmountable challenge, but it's a challenge nonetheless of ensuring that we have the proper rules and standards with a more dispersed grid as it relates to cybersecurity. I think on the whole, a much more technologically advanced grid will be a net benefit for consumers, but we have to acknowledge too that if you have a lot more access points at the edge of the grid, you are creating more vulnerabilities to the grid itself in a time when there are lots of actors out there who would like to do harm to that very grid. It's, as I said, it's not insurmountable, but it's a challenge that regulators at the state and federal level have to step up so that we have the rules and standards to ensure that we have proper cybersecurity protections. I'll move on to tension number 2. Tension number 2, I'll call, is the tension between infrastructure demands versus infrastructure development challenges. Under most future scenarios that you see, there's a fairly widespread belief that there will probably be increasing demand for infrastructure of various types, and I'll break down how that goes. And probably those demands are going to become greater and not less for a whole number of reasons: technological advances, market forces, and environmental regulations that are coming on down the line. And it's really affecting all aspects of the energy delivery system. Take, for example, natural gas. used to be that these markets were somewhat separate, but today you almost can't talk about electricity without talking about natural gas, and you can't talk about natural gas without talking about electricity. The two markets in many ways have converged. It's because we have a supply of natural gas that basically fell into our lap at affordable prices that we never thought we had. Remember, the planning assumption 10 or 15 years ago was the United States was destined to become as dependent on imported natural gas as we were on crude oil historically. That sort of assumption has been thrown out the window with the tight gas reserves that have been found. But this has put increasing demands for energy infrastructure to transport the natural gas around. Well, how does that get reflected? I'll give you an example on how pipeline constraints, infrastructure constraints get priced into the market and how it affects consumers. Take, for example, going into last year's winter, not this year's winter, but last year's winter, coming out of the polar vortex. Those of us from this part of the country and in North Dakota, we just called that winter. In the East Coast, they call it the polar vortex. It was cold, all right? Nonetheless, it put a stress on the system, and you started coming out of that winter and going into last winter, you had markets pricing in what had happened in the previous winter. Now, if you looked at forward natural gas contracts in the heart of the Marcellus region, where a lot of this gas is being produced, gas prices for, this is probably being sold in September, roughly, for January, February, dead of the winter forward gas contracts was about $2. That is dirt cheap natural gas. Now, if you move a little bit further away from the Marcellus to the north and east, and you get into what sort of the mid-Atlantic, think about Philadelphia, New Jersey, that area, those forward future contracts were somewhere in the neighborhood of $6. It's a little more expensive, but honestly, by historical standards, dead of the winter forward contracts, it's not at all unreasonable. If you move a little bit further north and east, and I realize I have a very warped view of distance being from North Dakota, what's a short distance and what's a long, but it's really not very far from sort of central Pennsylvania to New England. And you go to what they call the Algonquin City Gates. It's basically, think of it as a proxy for gas prices in the New England market, Boston. Those forward future contracts were over $20. That's very expensive natural gas. The reason for it is pipeline constraints. That's the pricing of congestion that you see reflected. And so obviously that then gets reflected in a region that's very dependent on natural gas for electricity and what? Electricity rates. You had very high going into the winter projected electricity rates in New England because of the tie to natural gas. And so you're seeing an increasing demand for pipelines so that electric generators can take access of some of the affordable gas. You also have environmental restrictions that are coming on down the line. Remember, natural gas emits about half the carbon that coal does, so it's an attractive compliance mechanism for carbon reduction strategies. Let's talk about electric transmission infrastructure, another area which will probably see increasing demands for investment. Utilities are no longer siloed quite in the same way that they were before. We're trading energy, electricity over bigger markets. Perhaps the biggest driver moving forward is going to be renewables. Remember, there's a couple of attributes about renewables that are really important to keep in mind. Number one is you tend to have the best resources where people aren't. Now, I don't get it. Being from North Dakota, I thought everybody loved the wind, but I guess most people don't like to live where it's really windy, right? So whether it's wind power, which happens to be in the windiest parts of the country, which are furthest from load, whether it's utility scale solar, which is really the most affordable form of solar that we have right now, which you really can't build in the middle of a load center city. You just need more acres than that to build a large utility scale plant. It has to be at least somewhat distant from load. That all takes transmission, some of which we have, but honestly, if we're talking about the renewable growth that has been projected in the country, not nearly what it will take. The second driver for transmission in renewables is this. In order for renewables to work, you can't pack them in a real tight geographic area. The reason, of course, is because, well, a couple of reasons. Number one, they're intermittent in nature, so you need to spread them out over a larger geographic area, so if the sun's shining in one spot, it can be compensated for where it's not, or wind blowing, and so on and so forth. And so you need to be able to transmit the power around a bigger geographic area. And all of this will be reflected in probably the demand for more transmission. Third area of infrastructure development, investment in the generation itself. Remember, if you're replacing, say, a 1,000 megawatt coal plant, you don't just build 1,000 megawatts of wind turbines. You have to build a lot more than that because as a nameplate capacity, what they actually produce is not nearly 100% of what they theoretically could all of the time because, again, of the intermittent resource. So that means a lot more turbines that go up, a lot more potential utility scale solar projects. The tension with all of these, whether it's natural gas pipelines, whether it's electric transmission pipelines, whether it's large wind farms, is these are all getting more and more difficult to develop from a siting standpoint. FERC just really deals, at least in the siting side of things, with interstate natural gas pipelines, having served on a state utility commission and having done the electric transmission side of things and the generation side of things. They're all areas which are getting much, much more contentious, more landowner opposition to it, sometimes not even landowner opposition, but just general public opposition, because not so much that you have interveners who may not be necessarily protesting a particular route, but just don't like the infrastructure as a general matter itself because they don't like what flows through or in the transmission infrastructure itself. So the irony is, of course, that a good reason for the impetus for the infrastructure itself is for environmental regulations driving down carbon, but at the same time, you have this tension of other groups that like to see the infrastructure itself blocked, the infrastructure that's being, in effect, mandated by the new environmental rules that we have. So this is going to be an increasing challenge and a tension that regulators are going to have to deal with. Why is it important, this issue of infrastructure development and challenges with getting it sited? It's because if you look at things like 111D regulations, the Clean Power Plan that is now a final rule that the EPA has drafted, there is an assumption in there that there's going to be probably coal switching to gas and there's going to be a lot more renewables. But in order to make that work, you have to have the infrastructure to make it work. And if you make a transition before the infrastructure is in place, you do end up with much, much higher costs for consumers. And it's been basically kind of the rule book around anywhere that you've made a transition like that where you don't have the replacement power, the replacement infrastructure to accommodate the new regulations. That's what happens. The case study, probably the best case study in the world, is Germany right now, which had some of the cheapest continental rates in Europe. Today, because of a number of actions, Germany has the second highest rates in Europe. The reason for it is Germany was very dependent on coal and nuclear, decided to phase out coal. About the same time that that decision was made, nuclear, which was always a difficult political fit in Germany, you had Fukushima in Japan, so Germany turned on nuclear, so we're not going to keep our nuclear plants open either. So you shut down coal, you shut down nuclear, you have some renewables, you don't really have any natural gas, and that natural gas which you have comes from Russia, not the best source of supply, probably geopolitically speaking, and their rates have, as I said, basically tripled. The only country that actually has higher rates right now in Europe, when I last checked, was actually Denmark, which makes some sense too, because Denmark, which is a very wind-friendly country and has cited a lot of wind. Remember, again, wind is intermittent, so you have to back it up with something. What were they backing it up with? They were backing it up with German coal, which they now have no access to either. So it's important for consumers that we get this right and that we have the infrastructure in place before we make the transition, not after. Tension number 3. The power of politics versus the power of markets. I think this is one that we're going to continue to see over the next few years. Remember that FERC, as we have overseen utilities and tried to determine what's a just and reasonable rate for utility in terms of what they're earning, we've moved in many cases away from traditional old cost of service regulations and have become more dependent on some sort of market signal to determine whether the utility is operating in the public's interest. And so FERC has really become dependent on some of these markets. But there are a number of forces in which sort of the power of politically where things may be going and how FERC has structured its markets and the dependency that states have had on these markets in many cases, I think potentially are going to come into a clash. I'll give you a couple of scenarios to show you exactly what I mean by this. So take this scenario. You're a governor, you're a legislator, and you're in a state that's required, as all states are going to be, to come up with a state implementation plan for 111D regulations. You have a certain carbon emissions target under environmental regulations that you have to meet. Now, it's not EPA's fault that this is how it was designed. It's the way the Clean Air Act is written, but the Clean Air Act says that the compliance is on a state-by-state basis. But remember, the electricity grid really isn't regulated by or doesn't operate on a state-by-state basis. So you're governor, you have to meet that specific target. Now, let's say you have 1 or 2 large nuclear units in your state, and let's even say that you're a state that's restructured your utilities. It's unbundled generation, so you've kind of given up the ghost in terms of regulatory authority over the generation plant itself. Every market signal, in some instances, right now is telling some of these nuclear generators that you should be shutting down. And here's why. Because they're competing in some of these market regions against, as I said before, really, really cheap natural gas. Right? So the market signal is you should be shutting down. In some of these states, you have high renewable portfolio mandates, so that isn't going to be able to be accessed by the nuclear generator. You might be a nuclear generator whose license is coming up, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is saying you have to spend several $100 million to keep that plant going if you want to be relicensed. All of these regulatory signals and market signals are saying that plant should be shut down. But it's a large 100% carbon emitting free source of energy. So what's a likely scenario for a governor, for a legislature that is in a market region and is faced with that scenario? Is the likely response to that going to be, well, okay, well, we don't mind losing the jobs, we don't mind losing the tax base, we'll just buy our credits through an interstate sort of regional trading program, and we'll just sort of let things be as they are, or and let FERC markets operate as they have been, or is the more likely response the governor is going to say, we are going to subsidize and do whatever we have to out of market to keep that nuclear plant open because, number one, I don't want to lose the jobs in my state, I don't want to lose the tax base in my state, but also I can't afford, from a compliance standpoint on the Clean Power Plan, to lose that, because once you lose a large carbon-free source of energy, whatever you replace it with will probably have some component of natural gas in it, which is only going to incrementally add and make your compliance target that much more difficult. I think politically speaking, you will probably see most governors and legislators that are given that scenario tipping towards saying, if it screws up FERC markets, that's FERC's problem, but I got a problem, which is all these jobs in my state, and I have to meet the Clean Power Plan. Scenario B. This one's not as speculative, it's actually happening. Take a region like New England. New England is a region that if any region was out there that could, as a matter of reducing carbon, adopt a cap and trade policy, it would probably be New England. They already have something cap and trade like, which is RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a restructured region of the country. It's a market region of the country. And it's a region of the country that politically you could probably do it in. But if you look in the real world at what states are doing in terms of driving carbon emissions, even beyond what the Clean Power Plan calls for, one thing you don't hear is about using purely a cap and trade mechanism to, in a market efficient way, make those resource decisions. What you're seeing happen is states saying, you know what, we'd like to, out of market, contract with Canadian Hydro. We'd like to, out of market, choose this particular resource. We'd like to, out of market, choose that particular resource. All of this helps to degrade the markets that both states and FERC have depended on, but I think it shows the allure of sort of the political reality of the world that we live in. And I would say if cap and trade in sort of a pure market model isn't going to work in New England, it probably is a dead letter in places like Bismarck and Denver and Boise and other states around the country where it's less likely to be embraced. Tension number 4, and then I'll wrap up, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. And this also deals with politics, and it is the power of politics versus the independent regulatory model. For for years, other regulators at the state level have done a number of collaboratives with regulators around the world, many of them in emerging market economies. And we would we'd go to Eastern Europe and other places around the world, and we would talk about the importance of the independent regulatory commission model, which has kind of just been the assumed model that we've had here in the U.S. with regard to the energy sector, the electricity sector, for probably 100 years or more, and talk about why the independence of the regulator is so key. And so we talked to these folks in emerging economies why you should follow that independent regulatory model. And it's because in certain industries that are sufficiently complex, that are sufficiently important to the economy and health and well-being of the country, you need some insulation between the political process and between an expert agency that can deal with some of these issues and make decisions that have to be made that sometimes may be politically unpopular, but you need that sort of insulation in a quasi-judicial manner, which is how utility commissions have traditionally operated. In fact, it's sort of an interesting, to give you an idea of that philosophy in action, sort of just as an anecdote, the California PUC, when it was created as the California Railroad Commission, to this day is headquartered in San Francisco. It's not headquartered in the seat of government in Sacramento. The reason for that is because this very sort of notion that the progressive reformers had, which is that you needed political insulation between the regulator and the rest of government and undue influence. And Sacramento being the seat of government, where the railroads were very powerful, the folks who wrote into law what became the California PUC, didn't want it anywhere near Sacramento. So they put it in San Francisco, and to this day, the California PUC is in fact headquartered in San Francisco for that very reason. But it underscores the notion of the independent regulatory agency, making a decision based on a record that's developed in a judicial model, and once a decision's made, then that decision can be appealed to a court, an independent court, and a judge can take a look at the decision and say, did they make, those regulators, a reasonable decision based on the record that they have in front of them, as opposed to a purely political decision. So, I mean, think about some of the challenges that we've seen to that sort of model in recent years. Take, for example, something we've all learned an awful lot about, which is the Keystone XL pipeline project, which I think is probably a particularly trenchant case study in how you do not want energy infrastructure to be politicized, right? All of us by this point probably have an opinion on Keystone XL. I happen to think it should have been permitted. Some of you may believe that it should not have been permitted. But one thing I would hope we would all basically agree on is that the process that went through was a debacle. Really, when you think about it, a 7-year decision-making process that was swayed in one way or another by millions of dollars of campaign advertising on both sides, all of which ending up with a decision that, at least arguably, may not be able to be reviewed by a court to determine whether a reasonable decision was made or not. That is not, thank goodness that the Keystone pipeline was sort of the exception to the rule and not the rule, because most infrastructure doesn't have to go through that particular State Department permitting authority. Most of it runs through independent regulatory commissions that have to make their decisions based on a record developed in front of it. That's not the only example, though. If you really want to rip some stories from the headlines on the challenges to the independence of the regulator, you really need no further than just the last few days. Some things that have happened around the country at different state public utility commissions. Probably the best example, I was reading some of the media clips on the plane ride over. There was a recent decision by the Nevada PUC that dealt with how they design their rates regarding rooftop solar. Now, I don't have a particular vested interest in that. It wasn't heard before me, but the reaction to it, to me, I thought was interesting in terms of a misunderstanding about how public utility commissions go about their business. For those entities that were disappointed and disagreed with the decision that this independent quasi-judicial body made, some of the quotes in the article that I was reading were things like, the governor needs to get control of his political appointees. Now, there are actually laws in place that deny the ability for a governor or any other elected official to engage in ex parte communications to get control of their political appointees. No one would say the president really needs to get control of those Supreme Court justices, right? That's the value of an independent judicial model, is that there's supposed to be some insulation between the political process and what happens in the context of those rate cases. And the reason that sanctity is so important is because ultimately that order has to be able to be upheld in a court, and that commission has to be able to describe to a judge in that order exactly why it did what it did. With that, I'm going to stop.
And what I want to do pursuant to the Weiser rule is get Professor William Boyd up here, who knows who took energy law, and give them the first couple of questions, and then he'll moderate the next panel. We are, again, blessed to have so many great students here, and I hope some volunteer, but if not, Professor Boyd won't be afraid to call on you.
Should we sit? Sure. Or can we sit? Yeah. Well, thank you, Commissioner Clark, for So while people are working on their questions and getting their hands up, and I do see some familiar faces out there that I can call upon, Kevin, I'm going to give you a little bit of a pass just because of Dean Weiser's earlier comments, but we may have to come back to you. I do want to just start off with a quick sort of follow-up on your third tension here in terms of markets and regulatory models around the country. And I think in previous events here, it may have been your Schultz lecture, you laid out this sort of typology of regulatory models across the country, the traditional cost of service model, I'm talking primarily at the state level, but of course the wholesale power markets matter here as well. So the traditional cost of service model, the fully restructured model, and then the sort of hybrid model in between. And it strikes me that this is one of the big differences between electricity and telecom. So we never got a statutory overhaul in electricity. We're still sort of working with the same jurisdictional split and the from the 1935 Federal Power Act and the ability of states to choose sort of how far to go down this road. And the limited reach of restructuring has sort of left us with this messy, so somewhat chaotic system. Do you see benefits and sort of virtues, underappreciated virtues in that diversity in terms of the ability for policy experiments and policy innovation across different kinds of models? Looking at this, obviously, based on your experience in North Dakota, but also now at FERC and looking across the whole country? Or do we need to kind of clean up the mess if we can, and is more uniformity what we should be aiming for, notwithstanding the difficulties of getting anything through Congress anytime soon?
Yeah, so there are a couple of challenges. Oh, is my mic not on? I'll just use that.
I think it's on. It certainly has a green light.
So there are a couple of issues that are contained in that. One is just the political reality of it would be very hard for Congress to approach anything near a more uniform system than we have right now. Two, I think there are some benefits that we can try to leverage given the world that we've got with regard to this sort of, as you put it, messy jurisdictional system that we have, which is the electric industry is one that is perhaps not quite as ripe for national solutions in the same way that telecom was. And the reason, in large part, is because of the way that this industry has grown up and the differences that you have across regions. So, I mean, it really did grow up as a very siloed industry where you had particular utilities serving very particular markets, and they weren't terribly interconnected with each other. Now, those silos have started to break down as more transmission's been built out. Perhaps the bigger issue that I think really challenges this, however, is the resource bases that you have across the country are so different market to market. The nature of serving particular regions is so different market to market. Serving a very, very population dispersed area like the West that has particular resource bases that might be strong in some areas but weak in others is very different than serving the New England market, which is very has high density and doesn't have access to all the renewables that you do in the West, which is very different than serving the Pacific Northwest market, which is very, very highly dependent on a large hydro resource that you just simply don't have anywhere else in the country, which is very different than California, which is very different than the Midwest. So I think some of those challenges are probably hurdles that at this point at least are too big to overcome. But nonetheless, as you said, the beauty of some diversity is you've got some ability to innovate and to have incubators for different policy outcomes that perhaps one region of the country can learn from another.
So, questions, students. There, I see a couple back here. Is that Si Wong there? Yep. Si, do you want to?
Hi, Commissioner. Thanks for talking to us about this. And
You bet.
one thing that I'm kind of curious about that I don't think you kind of went on to describe is when you met with people in I think you said Eastern European countries and talked about having independent regulatory agencies there. I think I can imagine that the political economy in those countries are quite different. And I've been sort of looking at how electricity works in other countries, and I just feel like sometimes I read a lot that those are really hard challenges to maintain an independent regulatory agency just because like the politics and the political economy is so different in those areas. So what are some of your insights from talking to these people there?
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. You've touched on a real point. It's interesting that coming out of the Cold War and then the evolution of market economies in Central and Eastern Europe, American regulators, I think to our credit, I wasn't there at the time, but have been lucky to participate in some of these dialogues since I have been involved, really did take up the mantle. Regulators themselves, working with USAID, working with the State Department and others to try to build up in a helpful way the regulatory capacity of economies that were so state centrally planned into something that looked like more of a market. And obviously, we, I think, can bring value to the table in talking about this particular regulatory model that we have, which is the quasi-judicial independent regulatory commission model. And you are exactly right. In certain parts of the world, making that transition is very, very difficult. Some have managed to do it relatively successfully, but you even see today, I mean, you don't have to look too hard to find the headlines about what's going on in the Ukraine and the Central European countries, that making that transition and viewing energy as a business that's regulated as opposed to a part and parcel of the government itself is a huge transition to make. Some are handling it successfully, some it's a bigger hill to climb.
Great question, C, who's doing her dissertation on the power sector in China. So she'll have lots to report on that along the way. I'm going to call on a former student I see back there who always raised his hand in class and lives and breathes energy and environmental law, Brandon Dittman. His hand was always the first to go up. And so I know he has a question to ask, and then we'll see if another current student has a question, and then we'll go to the audience.
Thank you.
And if you could just introduce yourself and tell us who you're working with now.
Okay. I'm Brandon Dittman. I work for Kissinger and Fellman, do energy regulatory, telecom, utility work in general. One of the things we kind of talked about was the tension between local control and larger regional control. It's a question particularly important in Boulder, where we're municipalizing or want to municipalize the electric system. And also you see this in broadband as well across Colorado. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that tension.
Sure. I put it in a couple of different ways. So I won't speak specifically to municipalization in Boulder. I know it's a hot button issue.
We'll rush you
Although
out
I've
of the
been-
room after you finish.
I've been asked about it every time I've been here, and I mean everyone
Right.
who's talked to me about it is lovely, and they're so nice, and so I appreciate the dialogue is great. I mean, basically decisions about how you want to regulate your utilities are decisions that are made by the people who are affected by it, right? I mean, I'm not one to say that there's one particular model that you have to have, right? The investor-owned utility model can work and has certain strengths and has certain weaknesses. The municipal model can work, as we have lots of municipal models around the country. It has strengths, it has weaknesses. The cooperative model can work. And we have lots of examples of successful cooperatives, and there are strengths and weaknesses to each of those. So I'm not going to take a side in that particular issue. I would say, though, that with regard to the issue of local kind of issues in energy and broader regions, I think that you're going to continue to see a need for, let me put it this way, not just a need, but a drive for regional issues to become local issues and vice versa. Now, why is that? I think it's because of where you see the grid evolving in terms of what I was talking about with renewables, which is renewables just don't work very well in very compact geographic areas. You need to spread them out over a broader region. California is learning this. With as much rooftop solar development as they've been having, they're now running into problems where you end up with situations in the middle of the day, which used to be your peak time of day when you had the most need for generation resources to come online. They're in oversupply situations. They have too much power on the grid, and they can't get rid of enough of it. Well, what's the answer to that? Well, the answer is you have a broader region in which to sell that excess power into so that the other parts of the region can sort of soak that up in times when you don't need the power. And at the same time, there's times on the California load curve where they need to import power. They're still fairly dependent on imports, and they need to depend on the rest of the West. So some of these issues that used to silo off utilities and regions and localities, I think are driving us just the opposite way now, where it's increasing regionalization of grids.
Interesting. Other questions? Here, right here in the middle. You've been very patient. Thank you. I think we have time for two more.
Thank you, Bill. I'm a former student, so I qualify to put my hand up early. But Commissioner Clark, I'm Lynn Green. I'm the CEO of the Lucky Corridor Transmission Projects, which you might recall from all of our FERC cases.
Yeah.
And we are building transmission along the Colorado-New Mexico border to repower Four Corners, and we're part of that import into California of renewable energy. And really what we've got is a huge area there that has wind coincident with southwestern load both daily and annually. So it's really unique. And of course, we're ecstatic about the production tax credit. And everyone is trying to figure out, okay, are the regs going to change for the PTC? It looks like probably the IRS right now is thinking, oh, we'll just leave the regs the same. But the problem in those regs, because of all these short PTC extensions that we've had before this new 5-year one, is there is absolutely no credit for transmission. Whether it's a gen-tie or whether it's regional or backbone transmission, building the transmission gets absolutely no credit under the IRS regs for vesting the PTC. Yet, under traditional project finance, in order to close the financing on the wind farm and get the building done this year that we're all trying to build, the transmission has to be started first. And as you know, most of the grid improvements are done around changing the generation mix every 50 years or whatever. So this is such an absolutely key time. I'm thinking the FERC should write a nice letter to the IRS. I'm dead serious here. No, I really am. I don't know why you wouldn't. If what you want is grid modernization, and this is the greatest time for grid modernization that you're ever going to see in your career is right now with the last 5-year PTC. We need the PTC to be competitive in all the areas for the future where you do have to build transmission into the big project areas. And just a nice little letter from the FERC to the IRS saying, hey, let the start of construction include at least the start of the gen-tie and not just putting the turbines in the ground.
Yeah.
Interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah, I hadn't heard that specific issue. I will take it under advisement. But yeah, I mean, transmission development is difficult anywhere, as I indicated in my prepared remarks. It's particularly difficult in the West. One thing I give the administration credit for was an attempt, they called it the Rapid Response Team, which was an attempt to try to marshal a number of agencies, the Department of Energy, the Interior Department, Ag Department, if there are Forest Service lands that are being crossed, to try to somehow streamline the painful permitting process that you go through if you cross federal lands, which if you're building a linear project in the West is almost impossible to miss. But even with all of the institutional push of the administration behind it, I would say that the success was probably fairly modest. The institutional bureaucracies that are built up in a way that makes it difficult to develop projects that are probably going to be needed going forward is significant.
We could take one quick final question all the way back. Cameron, is that you? Cameron Brooks? Yeah. And then we're going to a 15-minute break, and the next panel will start at 2:15.
Thanks. Hi, Commissioner Clark. I'm Cameron Brooks with E9 Insight. We track a lot of the activities of state public utility commissions.
Yeah.
You drew a parallel at the beginning to the transition in telecom to the transition today. It seems like one of the big differences then was that came about as a result of a legal challenge, not a collaboration between regulators and the incumbents. But today there's a lot of discussion about how there should be a more collaborative approach to this transition. I struggle to look at any other industry and see how historically that's happened. It seems like usually it's been more contentious. Do you think there's a reason we should be confident that a collaborative approach will actually achieve the transition that we're looking for?
I think it's both. I think it would be hard to cordon off and say it's just kind of public policy and collaboration, or it's just litigation that in court cases that bring that about. Even within the electricity industry and the energy industry, that's true, right? I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but talking with FERC staff who lived through natural gas restructuring, I mean, the horror stories that you hear about a painful 20-year process of litigation and stranded costs and court decisions and remands back to FERC. It was as contentious as probably anything that AT&T went through during the Judge Green days. Electric restructuring, at least initially, was very much a state-by-state and at the federal level a FERC activity. I mean, it just didn't happen through collaboration. FERC seminal orders on 888 open access, Order 1000, setting up of regional transmission organizations. These were all heavily litigated. And there's going to continue to be a lot of that, I think, moving forward. I think where the analogy is, what I was hoping to draw, is that within the context of that, there's also a lot of things that happen in society that then start taking events over. And in the telecommunications industry, the rapid development of telecommunications, information technology, end-use equipment, killer apps that then really kind of drove towards innovation and competition is what eventually took it over and really cleared that last step. So you started getting technology in the marketplace working. We're not quite there with energy. We're a ways behind in innovation on the energy side of things, but it's coming along. And the information technology and the innovation at the edge of the grid is beginning to get there in a way that I think starts to build upon itself. I don't know what the killer app is that we get in the energy industry that turns it into something other than what we've kind of had up to this point, which is basically a commodity, which is somewhat hard to differentiate the end product from other deliverers of the end product. But I think eventually you get there. I don't know what it is, but with the pace of development, it's where we're heading.
Well, that's a great note to end on. We may hear about the killer app in one of our 3 panel discussions coming after this, but please join me in thanking Commissioner Tony Clark for